When looking for a secure communication solution, there are a lot of different options, including free-to-use consumer-grade apps. These apps are probably already in use within your organisation because without vigilance they can seep into business use without any oversight from the organisation. Often this is because employees use the apps in their personal life and they seem like a quick and convenient way to communicate, and you can't blame them for that. However, while these apps claim end-to-end encryption, do they really meet the needs of an enterprise? Are they robust enough for professional use? And what extra do paid-for enterprise solutions really offer? As we've covered many times in the Armour Comms blog, there is much more to security than just encryption, and this is a crucial point made by the UK National Cyber Security Centre in its document Secure Communications Principles. In our next two podcasts, we talk to David Jones, who is Senior Pre-Sales Engineer at Armour, and he explains each of the principles and why they're important. In this, our first podcast, we cover the first four principles. Okay, Dave, so the first principle is protect data in transit. Can you explain that for us, please?
Yes, basically it's quite a simple concept, is that the data that flows from the sender to the recipient should be secured, so no one else can actually read it or alter it in any way between the 2 points, so that what you receive as a receiver is what was sent. And it's basically as simple as that. So what we're looking to do is to ensure that end-to-end it's not tampered at all. And so we kind of accept that as being a given, but in reality, there's a lot of options where the data could be changed. So if we can encrypt the solution, the product, to end-to-end, it means that it can't be altered and it can't be read. But that's not as simple as it may seem, because there's lots of different technologies you could use. And we want to make sure there's no risk the technology somehow decrypts the data halfway through the transmission, allowing someone else to read it. So we need to ensure that when that is done, when it's passed through the system, that no one is able to listen in and get a sneaky peek at the data. So when we say data here, it could be a text message, it could be a group chat, it could be an audio call or a video call. So all those need to be secured, encrypted from end to end to protect those. So we really want to make sure that any unauthorized people sitting on the line just see effectively garbage. They won't see the real data because it's all securely encrypted. So we have lots of techniques around that to do that. And as a user, it's very hard to actually see that security is in place because we're just the user. We don't see the underside of the product, what's going on. So you need to make sure the products that are used really have gone to town and really worked out how to secure the solution end to end, applying good key management and key encryption technologies in there.
Okay, so the second principle is to protect network nodes with access to sensitive data. What does that mean, Dave?
So basically, we need to make sure that our precious data, when it leaves us as the sender of a message, cannot be read or intercepted, altered by someone on the way. We need to make sure then that any sensitive points in the system between us and the recipient are adequately protected. So in the physical world, we mean that the servers are all protected in terms of physical security and network security to make sure that access to them is restricted. And that's kind of a given these days, but as we come to the more sort of virtual world and interconnected world, lots of things are purely defined in software. So we need to make sure that access to the devices that the data flows across are adequately controlled, using formal processes to allow people to gain access both logically and physically into like server rooms or to log on to administration consoles and so on. So, and if there's points in the system where the messages are at rest, so stored on a database, for example, those are protected in appropriate manner so they cannot be intercepted by someone else. So, for example, I send a message to you, and that a message then sits on a server waiting for you to pick up the message. That server should protect that data whilst it's sat there so that it cannot be read. So typically that means encryption of the database. But there's the additional technique as well we shouldn't forget in terms of having logical access to the servers to be able to read those from some administration console, and also physical access to any devices or server rooms where the data may lie. So we need to consider all the things that sort of sit in the system, both physical and virtual and software based, that the user is effectively using without realizing to protect those, because the attacker will be thinking of all the points of attack to work out where they could go to find the data. So we need to, developing a solution, consider all the aspects and think more widely than just maybe the solution at hand, but where that solution will go. So typically when we are sending a message to someone else, we don't know where through the network it's going. If we're going to talking to a partner, for example, we will be leaving our network and crossing the internet and going through someone else's network. So there's lots of different areas there which have the potential for a malicious actor to sit and listen. So there are some areas where, as a software product, we can control those through encryption or authentication, but a lot of the other areas are really beyond our control. So we need to have solutions in place that will mitigate against those through the use of security technology such as encryption to protect those.
Okay, that's thank you. That's interesting and complicated.
Yeah.
Okay, so the third principle is protect user access to the service.
Okay, so the user will need to connect to a couple of things to use the service. They first of all connect to their device, which could be their mobile app, a mobile phone, or maybe a desktop solution. And then from there, they connect into the application itself. So those two things need to be considered in how you use a solution. If I just had no security at all on my phone and I could just pick it up and use it, then that means that anyone else could do the same thing with my phone. So we need to ensure that the solution is taking advantage of the security technologies that are in our mobile devices. And in many ways, the manufacturers of the mobile devices have created a lot of security in there that we would want to see leveraged to increase the security of application. So all modern mobile handheld devices would typically enforce having some sort of authentication to actually start the phone up and to gain access. So typically these days that's biometrics. So by that we mean a fingerprint or a facial recognition. It is possible to be able to disable those for convenience, but the problem is that convenience then means that those security features are no longer useful. So if I leave my my phone on the bus or on the train, then potentially everyone can use my apps, which is really what we don't want, because we don't want people to be able to read my messages and also send messages, which would be equally bad. And on top of that, so we want to protect gaining access to the mobile device, but then we want to make sure that the app itself has some controls in place outside of the device it's sat on to control access. So we want to make sure the app has some technique of its own, so it's not relying on the operating system of the device. So we would typically want, again, the biometrics to be kicked in as soon as the user goes to use the phone. And we're used to doing that every day because a lot of our apps will require us to do that. So if I want to start my messaging app, I may have to enter some sort of code, a 4-digit, 6-digit code, or maybe use biometrics again. So that means if my phone is unlocked, because sometimes you have a timeout of a minute, 5 minutes, whatever, you still want that app to protect you. So if I do leave it open, someone can't actually go and use the app. So we want to make sure that there is systems in place and that the application will protect itself using those tools from unauthorized access by encrypting the necessary data that only becomes available by the authentication techniques of the host operating system to unlock itself. So we're really adding in layers of security there to make sure that people can't gain access to the app to read the content, which would be very useful, to forward content to another device to look at it later, or even send content masquerading as me, which could be embarrassing, it could be sort of misleading, it could have follow-on consequences. So you want to make sure that the whole authentication process is a chain of events, from starting the phone to logging into the phone to using the app.
Okay, yes. So the Armour app builds on the security of the device itself.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
Okay, so the next principle is ensure secure audit of communications as provided.
Okay, well, so everyone understands the concept of a messaging app and being able to send messages, video calls, and so on to each other. And then we've all used those in our consumer-based applications, and they're really useful. But when you start looking at the commercial world, the private sector, the government and the public sector, then there becomes the issue then of being able to have oversight of what people are doing. So it's not just enough to have sort of cryptographic methods to lock down the device, to encrypt the data in transit, and to control who can gain access. We want to be able to monitor the usage of the system to then have tools in place to spot unusual behavior. So what we're talking about here are things like an audit log, additional things, so we can see when a user logged on, when they sent a message, who they sent the message to. They potentially have the option of seeing the message, maybe that is a text message or the attachments are sent out, but having mechanisms in place to be able to secure those. And while they may seem at first as optional extras nice to have, in most organizations these days, this audit will become a very large factor in the successful deployment of a solution. And in fact, many projects have the potential to fail because the audit team will say the product isn't sufficient for the environment. So certainly when you've got regulatory compliance, such as in financial services, around healthcare, anywhere where we need a chain of evidence, then the audit has to be in place. It has to be sufficiently detailed to enable people to go back and see what happened. So that can be because of sort of network attacks through malicious actors, or it could be for compliance reasons of you sent this message to so-and-so, why did you do that? So it may not just be from outside attack, but also from more traditional levels of audit control. So you want to be able to have an audit in place. But of course, an audit then is a great repository of all the stuff that an attacker would wish to get hold of, because that's where everything is. So you need to make sure that the audit is secured so that people can only access the audit logs when they have sufficient rights. That does mean that by default, users of the system have no access, but also the administrators by default should have very limited access, and it should be granted on a needs basis. So a default deployment should really restrict who can see the audit side. So the audit tools should not be generally available to administration staff. They typically would want to be separate tools outside of the main management console and main management tools. And they would be sort of purposely deployed to specific team members for their use and onto their devices. So we want to make sure that we can then see who gains access to the audit log, when they did that, and what they looked at. So then we can make sure that attacks and malicious use can be seen in the audit. So well, those are the kind of the authentication controls in the audit to make sure the user is who they claim they should be. We also want to make sure that people can't go around the side, so to speak, and access the data by simply reading the database, because ultimately all the messaging system will be residing in a database somewhere. So we want to make sure that someone can't just get a database log-on account and go away and read some records off the database. So what we need to do is to ensure that the audit logs are encrypted themselves. and not encrypted, not just at the database sort of high level of the database is encrypted, but the individual records are encrypted so that access to them has to be done through a sort of fine-grained control where the auditor has to request the sufficient rights to the keys to that user. So, for example, we've got user A and user B, and they're sending messages to each other. They would be typically encrypted such that only user A and user B's entries would be readable. So an auditor would need to get access to those keys. So to get access to those keys, they would need to put formal requests in. Those keys in themselves will be, access will be audited in the logs and in procedures as well, so that you can see a whole chain of evidence of who gained access to the keys and when. So every aspect of reading a message in the either sending and receiving as a sender and recipient, or as an auditor, is completely logged and controlled.
Okay, so there is quite a lot to providing an audit facility, which the consumer grade apps certainly wouldn't be able to provide.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, thank you for explaining all of that. That wraps up this session. In our next podcast, we'll be discussing the remaining 3 principles. In the meantime, you can download a copy of our latest white paper, NCSC Principles for Secure Communications, from our website.